Through the work not only of our politicians, but I regret to say on one occasion the High Court of Australia, fraud is built into the Australian electoral system in three areas. One is in relation to the lack of identity when you vote. Secondly, the fact that you can vote in a large number of areas and they are not linked by computer. And the third area is the ease with which people can register for voting, and the fact that there's a vast amount of registrations between the calling of an election and the closing of the rolls. Now, when it comes to a referendum, things will be somewhat different. I might make the point, because this is discussed in another session at this conference. The Australian electoral system is highly centralised. In the United States, it's decentralised, and we sometimes look down on the American system because ours is centralised. The Americans is decentralised. And there is a mistaken view in Australia. I think the politicians have pushed it. And this is that if you centralise something, it's thereby improved. The fact is, if you centralise something and it's not a good model for whatever you're doing, then it's spread throughout Australia. Quite often having different standards, different practices in different states is a good thing. In any event, ours is centralised. In the 1999 referendum, we had a leading psephologist, that is a person who specialises in elections, and Malcolm McLaren was his name. And he came along and addressed us on one occasion, and I asked him, I said, Mr. McLaren, do you think there will be fraud in this referendum? And he said, yes, there will be fraud in the referendum. I can't say how much, but the fact is, it won't really matter, because I expect the decision of the Australian people to be so strong that it will be of minimal effect in the referendum. One of the interesting things, and I thought about that for a while, why it would not be relevant, is that it is easier to import fraud into an election than it is into a referendum. It takes you a while to think about why that should be so, but the fact is that in an election, what is crucial are the marginal seats. As in the United States, in the presidential election, it's what they call the background states. We'd call them marginal states. They're the ones who swing from Democrat to Republican. And in Australia, in an election, the key seats are the ones which are going to swing between the Liberals and Labor. You know which ones are going to swing because they have small margins. They're usually the ones which swing. So if you're going to introduce fraud, you concentrate your resources on those seats. And that's where you get all of these fraudulent registrations between the calling of the election and the closing of the rolls. But when you come to a referendum, there are no marginal seats. There are the states. You've got to win 4 states. But the real point is to win the overall vote. To win the overall vote, it has to be spread across Australia. And there's no point trying to bring in fraudulent registrations in a large enough number of states to have an effect. You'd have to bring them into almost all electorates to have any effect. So fraud will be more difficult in a referendum. There will be fraud, but it won't be as big as an election. The important thing is that one of the things we must oppose in relation to a referendum is mail-in voting. That's different from absentee voting. Absentee voting is where you apply for a postal vote. And the AEC has been rather soft in policing the conditions. You're only supposed to get an absentee vote for certain specific conditions, but it now seems you can get an absentee vote for any reason whatsoever. A mail-in vote is different. That's where they send out the documents, they send out the voting sheets to everybody on the rolls. Now, the rolls are full of people who shouldn't be on the rolls, fraudulent ones, people who've passed away and the like. And they can end up in letterboxes and all over the place and used by other people. Mail-in voting is very bad, and that has been one of the big weaknesses in the latest American election. We had one experience of mail-in voting in relation to this issue in Australia. That was in relation to the Constitutional Convention. To save money, it was decided to make the Constitutional Convention elected, not in the normal way, but through a postal vote. And that's the way they did it. And anybody could have voted. All of those could have ended up, many of them ended up in the garbage tips. People could go around and collect them from letterboxes, or where they were left in foyers. They could go to nursing homes and offer to assist people. That's called ballot harvesting. Mail-in voting was an unwise decision of the government in relation to the Constitutional Convention, and it probably increased the vote of the Australian Republican movement because they worked closely with political parties who were used to doing this sort of thing in elections. We didn't, and consequently, we suffered. The second thing that we didn't have in the Constitutional Convention, this may not be relevant in any future affair, but it may well be that a government decides to call another Constitutional Convention on this issue, and that is that we weren't attuned, I wasn't involved at the time, but what we should have been doing was making sure that we had the preferences of other groups similar to us. Many of those votes were lost because people didn't do deals with one another to exchange votes so that the preferences flowed on. It was an optional preference system. You could put down your preference if you wanted to. You could put as many as you wanted to, but you didn't have to. It wasn't a binding thing. So we have to watch that if, again, there is a mail-in voting system. The important thing is that if there is another referendum, we must insist that there is a yes-no booklet. The law at present requires a yes-no booklet. I did the first draft of the no booklet in 1999, and I decided to do it in a different way. Summarize it into 10 points, and I suggested that they use different type for each of these. This has not been done before. I also said we should use all of our allocation. The Republicans used only half of their allocation, so many pages of the booklet were blank on their side, but full on ours, suggesting we had better arguments. And I used language which I thought would be understandable and which wasn't too legalistic. The Republicans, after the election, tried to get the rules changed. They wanted only one booklet to go to each house in which people were living, each residence. And we campaigned against that on the basis, it was for another proposed referendum. We argued that this would be the garbage tin amendment. It would encourage people to just throw things in the garbage tin if they were just marked to the occupant of the house or to the resident. They would end up in the garbage tin. You have to give each elector their own yes-no booklet. The other thing was there was a proposal that instead of the inflammatory language, the inflammatory untrue arguments they claimed were used by ACM in the no case, instead we'll have this neutral body to write the yes and no cases. You can imagine who would be on that neutral body to write our no case and to write their yes case. There is ominous news. I noticed in the ALP's 2020 platform, the draft platform, there is a proposal for a constitutional commission. And you can imagine what the job of that constitutional commission might well be. So we must keep very much aware of these things when we're running any future campaign in the future.